form. Okay, let's take a look at another example, this one from the scripture. In Matthew 27:4, Judas says, "I have sinned, for I have betrayed innocent blood." Let's take a look at that statement, or that argument. I have sinned, for I have betrayed innocent blood. Same procedure. What's the conclusion? Here we have a for, which is a premise identifier. Any statement before that is a conclusion. I have sinned is the conclusion. I is a singular statement, so it becomes all I, and we can translate that into something like all I am a sinner. And again, this sounds kind of strange, but it works logically. For I have betrayed innocent blood. I is the minor term, and we certainly use that to translate this statement. So now we have the minor premise as our stated premise. I have betrayed innocent blood. All I am a what? You could say something like a betrayer of innocent blood, or an innocent blood betrayer. Now, that means in this case the assumed premise is the major premise, because we've already used the minor premise. I has been used twice, and so this major premise has to use sinner and innocent blood betrayer. Well, is it all sinners are innocent blood betrayers, or is it all innocent blood betrayers are sinners? Which one gives us a valid syllogism? If I said all sinners are innocent blood betrayers, then, let me just write that up real quick, all sinners are innocent blood betrayers. Does that give me a valid syllogism? No, it doesn't. Which rule is being broken here? Which fallacy does this syllogism make? Well, the middle term is innocent blood betrayers. Is the middle term distributed in either of these premises? No, it's not. So this has a fallacy of an undistributed middle. Now, doing the charitable thing and assuming that Judas was arguing validly, we then have to realize that what he was assuming is that all people who betray innocent blood, all innocent blood betrayers, are sinners. That's the assumed premise. Now, one thing you can note, my conclusion is a universal affirmative. The only form of syllogism that's valid with a universal affirmative conclusion is the AAA1. Only AAA1 has an A statement and is valid. An A statement for the conclusion and is valid. So if your conclusion is ever a universal affirmative like this, you know you're going to have to run with an AAA1 for your syllogism. Okay, let's take a look at one more example. This time we'll take a look at an example where the conclusion is left assumed. So far we've looked at examples where the major premise is assumed and the minor premise is assumed. It's rare, but occasionally the conclusion is left assumed. For example, in Matthew 10:40, Jesus says this, "He who receives you receives me, and he who receives me receives the one who sent me." Now he's talking to the disciples, and he says, "He who receives you receives me. He who receives me receives the one who sent me." Now, again, these are singular statements, and so we can translate them as universal affirmatives. He who receives you receives me becomes all receivers of you. All receivers of you are receivers of me, or perhaps will be receivers of me. He who receives you receives me. And then he says, "He who receives me receives the one who sent me." Well, we have universal affirmative statements, so we're probably going to put this into an AAA1 form again. He who receives me receives the one who sent me becomes then all receivers of me are receivers of the one who sent me, which is the Father. Receivers of the Father. And so my conclusion is left assumed. What's the conclusion? Well, following the pattern of AAA1, receivers of me is the middle term, so it disappears, and we get all receivers of you are receivers of the one who sent me, or receivers of the Father. So Jesus lets us assume the conclusion. He who receives you receives me. He who receives me receives the one who sent me. Therefore, he who receives you receives the one who sent me. To receive a disciple is like receiving the Father himself. Okay, I want to point you to exercise 31. In exercise 31, you're translating enthymemes into standard categorical form. And I want to help you through a couple of those first. Exercise 31, number 3 says this. Says, some young people are not rebels, since not everyone rebels as a teenager. Some young people are not rebels, since not everyone rebels as a teenager. Again, that since shows up in the middle of the argument, and so it's a premise identifier. The statement before it is the conclusion. Some young people are not rebels. Some young people are not rebels. Now, since not everyone rebels as a teenager, means not all teenagers are rebels. Not all teenagers are rebels. Not everyone rebels as a teenager. That means some teenagers are not rebels. Some teenagers are not rebels. And since rebels is my major term, that has to be my major premise. Well, what sort of statement will give me a valid syllogism? The conclusion's negative, but here the premise is negative. And so the assumed premise has to be affirmative. The number of negative conclusions has to equal the number of negative premises. It has to be affirmative. But this premise is particular, and you need at least one universal statement in order to make a valid argument. So it has to be a universal affirmative. And we've already used rebels twice, and so it has to be universal affirmative that has T and Y in it, teenagers and young people. So is it all young people are teenagers, or all teenagers are young people? Well, teenagers is going to be my middle term. Some young people all young people or teenagers would have an undistributed middle. And so it has to be all teenagers are young people. One negative conclusion, one negative premise. R is distributed in the conclusion, but it's also distributed in the premise. And the middle term, T, is distributed here. So this gives me a valid syllogism. And that would be an accurate translation.